Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you very much to everyone here. I'm really enjoyed the session that we've just had. Patrick Diamond said to me that this was a very interactive conference where it would be full of panels, but mine was the boring bit where there was a long lecture. I've been asked to speak for about 30 minutes about the ideas that underpinned the 1997 victory and our time in government. And of course, the first emotion that comes to the surface in thinking about 1997 is, no, it can't be 25 years since 1997. After all, 25 years before 1997 was 1972, and that is ancient history, really. But there's also a lot of other feelings that I have in thinking about the topic I've been given today. One is, I feel enormous pride in having been a small part of a really extraordinary team of people that helped build a collective muscle that then allowed the British people to vote in extraordinary numbers for a progressive political program. I also want to say, I won't dwell on this, but there's real sadness today. Since 97, we've lost some extraordinary colleagues, comrades, leaders. I'm thinking about people like Robin Cook, Mo Mowlam, Donald Dewar, Tessa Jowell. I mean, we launched the Sure Start program in 1998 at the Quorum Institute. And so it seems especially important to remember Tessa today. Also, Philip Gould has been mentioned. I've said before, there's a very large Philip Gould-shaped hole in British politics and in Labour politics, and has been over the last decade. But the other feeling is immense political frustration, because we weren't just trying to win one election in 1997. We were trying to lay the groundwork for a new dispensation in British politics, where instead of Labour governments being an occasional alternative to Conservative rule, we were in government more often than we were in opposition. Of course, you can't win all the time, but the goal was to be in government more often. Blair, lose, 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 is not the history that we wanted to write. And when Tony said he didn't want to be the Labour leader who had won 3 elections, but instead the first Labour leader to win 3 elections, he actually meant it. 1997, 2001, and 2005, in my view, have gained significance because of what's happened since then. People have talked about pre-97, and I'll address that, but we've also got to think about post-2010. In 3 elections, Labour found a way to stop losing, but since then has rejected that approach and reverted to well-trodden ways of doing so. By 2019, we were as unelectable as we were in 1935. And I want to make this point, because in the 1980s, the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, they claimed that the mold in British politics was that we were a 2-party system, and they wanted to create a 3rd party. That was a category error, in my view. The real mold is that we have a 2-party system where the Tories win for the vast majority of the time. Labour is strong enough to survive as the alternative to the Tories, but most of the time, too weak to win. Perfect for the Tories, bad for the country. And that's the mold that we wanted to smash in 1997. And in this lecture, I've given the lecture the title, which in the course of what I'm going to say is going to explain itself. I've given the lecture the title, Between the Obsolete and the Utopian, How to Understand the 1997 Project. And I'm going to speak about each aspect of that title. And as I say, Patrick asked me to look at the ideas that contributed to Labour's historic victory, and I do so because that's what he asked me to do, but also because I think ideas mattered, probably more than is realised, both in symbolising what New Labour offered and in shaping what New Labour meant, because I think there's a real danger in the way that the intent, focus, and purpose of the campaign has become lost, in fact distorted over time, and because this distortion, by placing the blame on our time in government for our successive losses since then, has had the real-world effect of denying Britain an effective opposition and an alternative government. And obviously, a lot more than ideas went into winning. I'm the first to say that. But ideas are the subject that I've been asked to address. And here's the argument in a nutshell. First, and it's almost the simplest thing I'm going to say, but it's the most important. Labour's long period in opposition after 1979 was the rule, not the exception, of our history. We'd only had 9 years of real majority government in our first 100 years. In my view, Tony Blair's insight, but also his willingness, was to grasp this and confront it head on. In the 1980s, there was a debate, some of you will remember it, about, quote unquote, the forward march of Labour halted. The implication was that there was something inexplicable about how the forward march of Labour had been halted. It was the idea that history was on our side, but actually history wasn't on our side. There was a structural problem in Labour's definition and in its appeal. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Secondly, the failure of Labourism, and I'll come on to explain why I use that phrase, the failure of Labourism after 1979, just as after 1951, was a failure of ideas, a failure of project, and not just a failure of organisation or leadership. Labour was stuck, and the country was stuck, because of its inability to be the leader of a broad, progressive national coalition to take the country forward, as opposed to a sectional part of it, protesting, arguing with itself, but not governing. Credibility and radicalism were at odds with each other rather than reinforcing each other. Third, the project of what I would call practical idealism, ideas that were neither obsolete nor utopian, is the key to understanding New Labour. Where it succeeded at the level of ideas, in fusing Labour's class interest with liberal reforms, collective action with individual aspiration, harnessing the centre and the apolitical with the left of politics, it finally achieved electoral dividend for the Labour Party and made change in the country. And when it failed to do so, and when it fails to do so, it loses. This was the real third way, which I'm going to try and explain today. And fourth, when it comes to the future, I don't believe in ancestor worship. Labour needs renewal, not restoration. No sensible person says Labour needs the policies of 1997. But Labour does need to understand its own history. Labour's losses since 2010 are part of a pattern from which 97, 2001, and 2005 were an exception. The reversion to type since 2010 explains, in my mind, why Keir Starmer has such a hard job, but it also explains why his efforts are so important and why he must succeed. We need to learn from our victories, not blame them for our defeats. So, for this lecture, I went back to Tony's leadership election statement of June 1994. It was the first thing that I worked on for him. In it, he wrote the following: to win the trust of the British people, we must do more than just defeat the Conservatives on grounds of competence, integrity, and fitness to govern. We must change the tide of ideas. I think this is really important. News was the weather. Ideas were the climate. And we set out to change the climate. Far from, and there was, in this argument that I'm going to make, not just a swing of the political pendulum in 1997. It was a swing driven by a coalescence of ideas that represented an unusual mixture in Labour history. Far from being neoliberal, as John McTurnan pointed out in the last session, a comfortable epithet in too many quarters, the project, quote unquote, set as its task the resolution of the progressive dilemma, which was the title of a book that David Marquand wrote. That dilemma, and I would argue tragedy would be a better word, the progressive tragedy, was how to break a century of defeats and combine the Labour coalition with liberal support, both at an organisational level and at an intellectual level. The chosen route to do so wasn't electoral reform or tactical voting, actually. The chosen route was through ideas as well as electoral strategy, to bring together ideas that were distinctively social democratic, in essence, the advance of social justice through collective action, with ideas that were small l liberal, essentially the extension of individual freedom in a market economy, and then to forge them into a single package. Now, you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to be able to go into any detail on this, but the closest thing since the real new Labour is the three-party German coalition agreement of last December that makes the drive for environmental sustainability core to the extension of individual freedom and the pursuit of social justice. And In case any of you are wondering, it's actually in English, so it actually repays the study. We didn't seek to continue the Tory trajectory. Instead, we pledged to change it. And in some of this, we succeeded a lot. In other parts, a little. And in some others, we failed. And it's important to be honest about that. I just want to start, though, with the context for the 1997 election. And quite a lot of people have referred to this. 1997 wasn't year zero. But I want to say something quite hard about what happened before. The context was that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the right didn't know what to do with its victory. The right of politics. It could sell quack economic theories to Russia, which it did, and which created some of the oligarchs who we're trying to sanction today. And on the left, Labour was confronting intellectual and political questions of a very fundamental kind. Eric Hobsbawm had challenged Labour's assumptions about class. Marxism Today had called out the crisis of the state and the collapse of organised labour. And feminists had declared time on political, policy and organisational strategies that ignored women. Now, in 1992, this flux was context for a stunning Labour defeat. What I would call a crushing rejection of a traditional version of social democracy. And it gives me no pleasure to say this, because we couldn't have done what we did in 1997 without Neil Kinnock, and we couldn't have done it without John Smith. But if we learn anything from New Labour, it has to be that we should look at the facts. Labour was not, in fact, very close in 1992. We lost by 2.5 million votes. And our share of the vote, 34%, was lower than any general election between 1931 and 1979. I didn't know that until looking into it for this lecture. In fact, it looked to many people like Labour could never win. The Nuffield election study, which has been mentioned, was called Labour's Last Chance, ? 97 was very different. People sometimes say we couldn't have lost. And of course, the Tories were exhausted and useless in various ways. But I don't subscribe to the view that Labour was destined to win, and certainly not with a majority of 179. And I hesitate to say the following because my friend David Ward is here and was really a fundamental part of John Smith's leadership. And John was brilliant at exposing Tory failings. He also set up the Commission on Social Justice, of which I was secretary, to come up with new ideas on the welfare state after the problems of the 92 shadow budget. But my confession to you, David, is at the time, and I used to walk up and down the boardwalk in Brighton and Blackpool after the two-party conferences with other people who went on to go into politics. My fear at the time was that there was a lot of continuity, and that worried me, because I felt we needed more change. And I joined Tony's team slightly late in June 1994, because my dad had died 9 days after John. And I didn't know Tony well at the time at all, but I do remember him writing something striking in a typically generous condolence note. He said that although he obviously disagreed with my dad's Marxism, he'd learned a lot from his diagnosis of the limits of Labourism. Both Tony and my dad understood Labourism, and the ism is important, signalling an ethos and an approach, not an institution. They understood Labourism to be a stultified form of Labour politics on parts of both the right and the left of Labour politics. Nostalgic, incremental, defensive, small c conservative. It wasn't bracing enough to win, open enough to rethink, broad-minded enough to appeal across classes, confident enough to be inclusive, strong enough to lead the country. And class and ideology were uneasy bedfellows in Labourism. And the narrative of Labourism is one of heroic failure, not pioneering success. And the point I want to make to you is that Labourism epitomized the problem of the progressive dilemma rather than solving it. It was suspicious of ideas, and while it talked about interests, was unclear about how to serve them. And as society changed, the ethos of Labourism made the party more comfortable looking back rather than forward. Now, what I'm going to explain later is that the pathology post-1979 had in some ways was in some ways a repetition of what happened after 1951. And we have to learn from that. I want to put to you that there are 4 factors that explain why 97 was so different from 92. And I haven't got time to go through all of them. They're about people, party, policy, and project. And I'm going to dwell on project, because I think the project was about building an alternative to Labourism. I haven't got time to talk about the people. Tony was a remarkable political phenomenon. I spent the 1st of May in Enfield, Southgate, with Stephen Twigg, going to driveways that had names, not numbers. And when we got back from the knocking up, there was a fax. Of course, there were no emails at the time. There was a fax from Walworth Road or from Miliband Tower, saying with Stephen's victory speech, and everyone fell about laughing, saying, "Well, that's pretty useless, isn't it?" But 6 or 8 hours later, he was reading out the victory speech very, very happily. But it wasn't just Tony. Gordon was a disciplined, unflinching dynamo with extraordinary political experience, and there were many others. There was people, there was the party. I've been in the Labour tribe for nearly 40 years, but that word is the problem, tribe. The Labour tribe is idealistic, determined, gritty, loyal, but the weakness is that we are prone to Stockholm syndrome of thinking that everyone thinks like us, but they don't. And in the 1990s, we didn't just build a big tent, we opened the side flaps so that all comers could come in, whether they were in politics or not, and they contributed in a range of ways. Thirdly, policy. This was my job after Tony appointed me in June '94. Anyone who lived through the '92 election should have learned that policy can cost you an election. When the Tory attack came, it was too late to change our spending plans, and we were nailed on tax. So my first task was bomb disposal. Get rid of policies that could blow up in the middle of an election campaign. Unfunded commitments, half-baked interventions, loose ends that spoke to interest group positioning, not a program for government. And Tony said to me, if there's a policy that blows up in the middle of an election campaign, you'll get blown up. So for goodness sake. That was my first job. But he also thought, and I think this is really important, that policy was more important than people realized for winning an election, not just avoiding losing an election. I don't buy that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them. And neither did he. He thought that policy could change perceptions, as with our crime policy. That policy could be a guarantee to the electorate, as with our education policy or our health policy. That policy could be a discipline on politicians, as with our policy on tax and spend. That policy could be a rallying call to the country, as with our policy on childcare or pensions. That policy could challenge obscurantism and narrow-mindedness, as with our policies on gay rights or on Europe. That policy could de-risk a Labour vote, as with our commitments to a referendum on devolution to Scotland, Wales and London, and referendum on the euro as well. Policy could speak to our ambition, as with our policies on creative industries, which James led, and our policies on arts and culture. And policy could do this too. It could show that we had learned the lessons for which the electorate had sent us back to the classroom after successive defeats. For example, in our insistence on switch spends to be the emblems of the difference between us and the Tories, most famously in abolishing the assisted places scheme to pay for the reduction in class sizes. Now, I was lucky enough to have the job of writing the 1997 manifesto. I remember that we had 176 carefully phrased promises, of which 169 were actually delivered in the first term of the government. But of course, the 5 on the pledge card were the most important. But in the light of the earlier discussion, I do want to remind you that there were 2 lines in every one of the pledge to get 250,000 kids into work, but the second line was how we'd pay for it. And with the NHS pledge as well. And the project, I want to link, though, those policies to project. Policy without project is ad hoc and disconnected. It's a really important warning for people today who say Labour needs, quote unquote, more policies. The project gave coherence to policy, and policy gave meaning and credibility to the project. And so together they were able to punch through to the electorate, and that's what I want to dwell on in the next 10 minutes and then finish up. It's easy to mock the idea of project. It's got a bit too much Italian Eurocommunism, Antonio Gramsci about it. Right. But the iteration between definition of the project and policy to symbolize it was the anvil on which the ideas of the 1997 manifesto and government were hammered out. The project was the glue between policy and vision. And the project was clearly an electoral one to change Labour from a losing machine to a winning one. But the electoral project I want to submit to you was only powerful because it was fused with a national project. A national project that requires analysis to unite behind, North Stars to follow, exemplars, including in local government, where Margaret Hodges' point I think is really important. Exemplars, domestic or international, to foreshadow the future. Now, I am going to quote Gramsci. He wrote about the requirement, quote, to address ourselves violently to the present as it is. In other words, you've really, really, really got to understand what the hell is going on in the country that you want to change. That's what we tried to do, because we were serious about getting into government, and then it would be our responsibility to fix it. Our national project was built on a hard diagnosis of the country's situation. Remember, the British economy was growing quite fast by the 1997 election. But we'd slumped in the World Education League. The NHS was losing the confidence of the public, and it languished in global health indices. Our political system was completely ossified. The collapse of community cohesion was evident in every town and city, and we were losing a beef war with the European Union that the government had chosen to fight. The problem, in other words, wasn't just that the wrong people were in charge. It was a more structural problem than that. And just preparing for this lecture, I went to I found a speech that Tony gave in 2003, which I didn't even know he'd given. And in it, he identified something that he called Britain's progressive deficit as explaining the purpose of the 1997 election. It's a good phrase. And in the speech he said, by 1997, quote, Britain was a long way from being a modern social democratic country. Our diagnosis, we didn't just have analysis, we had a diagnosis. It was that Britain was weak because it was divided, and it was divided because neither the political system, the economic model, nor the cultural mores of the country were adequate to the challenges of building a strong society and a strong economy in the 21st century. So the winning themes of the manifesto, future-stroke-modernity, equality-stroke-inclusion, arose from that clear critique. We thought that the governing philosophy of cut the state, let loose the market was insufficient. That was the Tories' wrong diagnosis. But we believed that a simple pendulum swing back to the state, especially an unreformed state, would solve very little. On this, as in other areas, we thought the electorate were ahead of the parties. They weren't prejudiced against government action, but they wanted to be convinced it would work. And I think there's actually modern relevance to this, given that the tax take today is higher than at any time since 1949 in the United Kingdom. So how the state works is going to be a fundamental issue for the country going forward, and therefore for politics. We aim to shape markets through a modern state that empowered rather than squashed civil society. This was how we would seek to extend personal freedom in a market economy and enhance social justice through collective action. We were trying to break the limits of labourism without losing the ballast that it provided. And that was the mindset that produced the national minimum wage and tougher competition policy, the minimum pension guarantee and child trust funds, alongside 3,500 Sure Start centres, signing the social charter and legislating for gay equality, literacy and numeracy hours, massive expansion of higher education, alongside pretty strong reforms to the teaching profession and student loans, independence for the Bank of England and tax credits, antisocial behaviour orders and early intervention programmes, and more police on the beat, and the Human Rights Act, and the ban on smoking in public places, windfall tax, etc., devolution to Scotland, Wales and London. The electoral project and the national project gained strength from each other because they became fused. And everything was driven by a need to marry a new position for Labour with a new direction for the country. And our argument was that the project to change the country could only be delivered by a changed Labour Party. And I want to summarise this. I was thinking about this on the plane this week. I think that what I'm trying to say to you is that a political project has 5 elements. 1, threat or opportunity. What's the problem or the challenge facing the country? 2, villain. Why does the problem exist? And it's not as easy as it seems, because it's tempting to personalize it when it's, the lesson of Trump, I think, is if you play the man, not the ball, you don't defeat him properly. You've got to defeat the ideas that are underneath it. Villain, why does the problem exist? 3, hope, what's the way to fix it? 4, protagonist, why are you the people to fix it? And 5, proof, how can we trust you? I think that by May 1997, we had our answers to that. I'm not saying they were perfect, but they were our answers. What were they? It was something like the following. The threat is a divided and declining Britain. The villain is an out-of-date philosophy and politics. The hope is a national renewal through a new balance of state, market, and community. The protagonist is a changed Labour Party. And the proof was in a set of commitments that defied conventional wisdom on our own side, because they were what we could control at the time. It was a deliberately big argument, and it applied across every policy area. Now, I do want to say a word about this widespread narrative that we became popular by aping the Tories. It's an odd claim, since it's the most unpopular government for many, many years. But that's what people mean when they say 40 years of neoliberalism. I don't buy it. What we did was we chose our ground, investment in public services over nationalization of utilities, a national minimum wage over a repeal of the 1980s legislation on ballots before strikes. But I think it's worth just pausing to really debunk this argument, because you can think of things that support it. There is a counter-argument. The best evidence for the claim that we were too sanguine about markets is that financial services were not more heavily regulated. It's a good point. I agree with it, actually. But we left them under-regulated, I think, because of complacency about a non-inflationary continuous expansion economy, not because of some adherence to quote-unquote neoliberalism. You can also make the argument that while we were relentless and actually quite effective at tackling poverty at the bottom of the income distribution, we were insufficiently focused on inequality at the top, including wealth inequality. That's a good argument and a fair critique as well. But the evidence for the claim that quote-unquote neoliberalism was unchallenged in 97 is, I think, outweighed by the evidence against it. Because if neoliberalism means anything, it means a belief in untrammeled market forces and a minimal state. That's what the adherents of that believe. But this was neither the mindset nor the policy map. And I'm not going to have time to go through it, or I hope in the course of the discussion we can get to it. But we expanded and modernized the role of the state rather than reducing it, most obviously in health and education. We regulated markets in the public interest rather than deregulated them, including in respect of trade unions and workers' rights, as John said. We sought to redistribute income and opportunity, £4,390 per person better off for the poorest half of the child population, the poorest half of the pensioner population better off by £1,970 to 97 to 2010. We actually did more under the slogan, we didn't use the slogan levelling up, but if you think about the New Deal for Communities, the social exclusion strategy, the attack on homelessness, that was more levelling up than we've seen from the current government. And I just wanted to make one other point about this national renewal plan. We try to do these things, or we try to apply this thinking at international level as well as at national level. Now, the really serious mistakes over Iraq have obliterated a lot of this record. But I just want to say a word about it. Social rights, environmental protection, and peace in Northern Ireland involved a central role for the European Union. That was explicit, not implicit. Mike referred to this. International stability and the battle against impunity was supported through our role in NATO. Leadership in the battle against international poverty went alongside a war on poverty at home. The campaign to win the Olympics was in part a product of the way the country was motoring along at home, but was also about building and reinforcing a national culture. And this wasn't neoliberalism, and it wasn't trickle-down economics, and it wasn't Tory light. And this is why so much of the debate about left and right inside the Labour Party is so confused. The real divide is radical Labour versus Labourism. Much of the so-called Labour left is actually quite conservative. And parts of the Labour right are radical on social questions, or, as in the case of John Smith, on Europe. At its best, New Labour was radical Labour. The third way is often described, not least by Tony, as borrowing ideas from right, left, and center of the political spectrum. But I want to make a different point. It was a third way within the center-left. It saw liberalism as too narrow, social democracy as too sectional, and so it sought to fuse them together. The problem, in my judgment, is not that we started down this road. The problem is that we didn't keep going. Now, let me just finish off on the following. Give an ex-politician a platform, and he speaks for longer than he's asked to speak for. But this is I mean, it pains me to say this, it makes me feel like granddad. This is of historical interest. People who worked on my leadership campaign are now professors of politics, and they're studying the history of New Labour, and I'm thinking, oh my God, it's wounding. But I think there is some modern relevance to this. My view is that a mistaken diagnosis of our successes and failings in government, essentially that we weren't, quote unquote, left-wing enough, has marooned us in opposition. After 2010, and in some ways after 2007, we ended up spending too much time apologizing for rather than rectifying what we got wrong, and too little time explaining, defending, promulgating, building on what we got right. You can be proud of your record while being humble about your mistakes. In fact, both are stronger when paired with the other. And in my view, Keir Starmer has made an essential, not just welcome attempt, to begin to change the narrative. He wants to learn from our wins, not just our losses, because if our only victories of the last 50 years are denigrated, 50 years, those 3 wins, if our victories are only denigrated as the abandonment of principle, then the wrong lessons are going to be learned. And I really want to pick up something that Margaret Hodge said. The work of constructing a political project is really, really hard at any time. It takes hard analysis, it takes real listening, it takes profound engagement with very difficult questions. At the moment, inequalities are complex, ecological and national security threats are profound, issues of identity are to the fore. It takes policy imagination about what works. And all of this has got in some ways more difficult as politics has changed in the last 25 years. And it's an intellectual endeavor. I was glad that Professor Fielding mentioned, I don't know if he's still here, but you mentioned Peter Hyman at the beginning. He's written something, I think, really appropriate to what I'm trying to say. Successful politics takes place at the intersection of what the country needs, what a politician believes, and what the electorate want. The first part sounds like management consultancy. What does the country need? The second part sounds like missionary zeal, but politicians should have a mission. And the third part sounds like focus groups and opinion polling. And that's right, but you have to fuse them together if you're going to develop a political project. Now, I want to finish with just this, I think, really extraordinarily relevant point that explains the title of the talk, Between the Obsolete and the Utopian. 50 years ago, in 1972, Robert Skidelsky, he's now Lord Skidelsky, wrote an article about an article that John Maynard Keynes had written 90 years ago, in 1932. And it summarizes the point I'm trying to make really brilliantly. Keynes's article in 1932 was called The Dilemma of Modern Socialism. And Skidelsky's article was called The Labour Party and Keynes. And this is how Robert Skidelsky summarizes Keynes's view of Labour. Remember, Keynes provided the economic underpinning for the Labour government, but he wasn't Labour. But this is how Skidelsky summarizes Labour's view. Quote, caught between the obsolete and the utopian, the Labour cabinet of 1931 had been totally unsympathetic with those who had new notions of what is economically sound. If you remember, the Labour cabinet rejected Keynesianism in 1931. Caught between the obsolete and the utopian, the Labour cabinet had been totally unsympathetic with those who have had new notions of what is economically sound. I think that's a brilliant description of Labour's historic error, to be tempted by the obsolete or by the utopian. It sums up how Labour goes wrong, how its right and its left can end up cautious when they need to be radical, conservative when they need to be progressive, retreating to the comfort of old ideas when it needs to be looking for new ones, losing when we could be winning. My reflection on 1997 is that we rejected both the obsolete and the utopian. We broke out of the limits of the tribe, but in the process we delivered more of what the tribe believes than any Labour government or any Labour Party since 1945. And that's the only way to win and the only way to change the country. And the two are related. And that's why I defend the idea of project in politics, but it's also why I defend the project of 1997. The challenge now, to be absolutely clear, is not to reheat it, it's to learn from it. Because just as 25 years ago, I see no evidence at all of any answers coming from the right of politics. So it's not just the future of the Labour Party that depends on our answers, it's also the future of the country. And that was the spirit that animated us in the 1990s, and I hope it's the spirit that can animate us today. Thank you very much indeed.